Hello everyone, I'm finally back with another devlog, and this one is all about remaking my game's graphics. I previously felt that they were lacking, so I decided to dedicate some time to fix them up. Eventually I finished, and I think the result is such a great improvement. Compared to before, it's like night and day. So I'd like to share a bit about how I designed these new graphics, as well as some interesting details about them. I'll start unassumingly enough with the grass texture. The original was very simplistic, so I was quite eager to improve it. My main strategy was to add the blades of grass with varying lengths and shades until all the gaps were filled. This worked well, but it took me many attempts until I had something I was happy with. The first one was too noisy, the second was too grainy, the third looked too much like bananas, especially if you make them yellow, the fourth was too grainy, and the fifth was too dark. But the final one had the perfect texture and proportions that I was going for. I then made some tile variations and added them to the game. I experimented a bit with darkening the tiles closer to the edges, which looked very good, but made it harder to see where the player can and can't stand, so I decided to change it back. I think the end result could be improved a bit more. Like maybe it could be a bit brighter, or have a pattern that tiles less obviously, but I would say that it's definitely good enough for now. The other half of the ground graphics, quite literally, are the undersides of the floating islands. The biggest problem with the originals is that they were way too small, making them very visually repetitive. To fix this, I made the sprite over twice as large. This had some important implications for making the pixel art though. Pixels are typically placed one at a time, and once you start making images larger, there's a lot more pixels to deal with. To try and make it easier on myself, I did something I wouldn't normally do with smaller objects, which is to make a sketch using larger brush sizes, capturing the general form of the rocky structure. I then later added all of the smaller details, like edges and highlights. I think this worked very well, especially with the sprite's rocky and naturalistic texture. Combined with the new grass, I feel like the floating islands are much more pleasant to look at and better represent what they're meant to be. Now I'd like to move on to some of the item and object graphics, starting with the floating material called Cetarium. It previously looked very spiky, but I wanted to change it so that it resembles cotton. To do this, I made the sprite very noisy, but used colors that are low contrast. I tried once and found that it was a bit off, so I tried again and ended up with something much better. The change isn't as noticeable as it is with the grass and the island undersides, but I definitely think it was still worth making. Somewhat related, I also changed the Cetarium box's sprite. It now has some writing on it and a latch, like an actual box. I hadn't actually considered how you would put stuff inside of it, so I thought it would be good to specify that with its visual design. After that, I completely redrew the compressor. In terms of design, the funnel has more depth, the edges are less rounded, the output slot is vertical, and the top and bottom are connected by a tube. I made these changes so that it would appear more distinct by emphasizing its mechanical nature. Overall, this redesign is probably my favorite of them all, because it's just so much better than the original. Something interesting I had to consider was the proportions of the funnel. It's meant to be a perfect square, but because the camera is tilted downward, I wasn't sure how to represent that properly. So I decided to try and use some math. If you're looking at a cube head-on with an orthographic camera, its projected height is its actual height, let's say 1. If you then begin viewing it at a 45-degree angle, its projected height will now be the length of its diagonal, which is the square root of 2, which is about 1.4. So if you want to draw a perfect cube from this perspective, it should appear about 1.4 times as tall as it is wide, or 0.7 times for the top and the front. At least, that's how I think it works. Anyway, for the compressor, which is 16 pixels wide, its top side should be 16 times 0.7 pixels tall, which is 11.2. I actually decided to round it up to 12 though, so that it can be an even number. Regardless, the end result is a mostly correct perspective. Up until now, I never really paid attention to the proportions of objects, but because of this situation, I'll probably consider it more carefully in the future. Moving on to the catcher, it's mostly the same story as all of the other objects. More detailed, better colors, etc. Its main improvement is that it now shows electric arcs to indicate when it caught something. Accordingly, it now only catches one thing at a time. The changes to the duplicator are also fairly unremarkable, except rather than being a cone shape, it's now a dome shape. This is simply because the dome shape fills more of the available space. I also changed the post, which now has a much more realistic wood texture. I did change the clouds as well, but I'm gonna be honest, I'm not actually sure that the clouds are better. Their shading is maybe a bit too flat, and the weird jagged edges are a bit distracting, so I'll probably change them again sometime soon. In addition to the sprite art, I also adjusted the environmental lighting. The first notable change is that object-created lights are now no longer visible during the day. Technically, because the sunlight isn't perfectly white, they should be visible, but it just looks a bit strange, so I decided to change it. I also reprogrammed the sunlight's behavior so that it can update every frame rather than every in-game minute, which makes the transitions appear much smoother. Lastly, I adjusted the sunlight's colors and timings. Now, it begins to get darker and more orange at around 5 PM, and turns more red as it approaches 7 PM, before becoming night. This makes the sunset just over 2 hours long. I believe this is much longer than it would be in real life, but I enjoy the atmosphere of sunsets, so I don't mind keeping it this way even if it's a bit unrealistic. I still might choose to adjust the timings in the future though. I also spent some time making additions to the HUD, including new icons for the inventory, a weight counter, and smooth item scrolling that I spent way too much effort on. The icons were fairly straightforward, though I did add a new item called the Satarium Chunk, which you can get from using the compressor. I also tried to modernize the text boxes, which meant adding a partially transparent background, white text, and an indicator to show when you can progress. And that basically covers all of the new features. Overall, I think the changes I made definitely improved the game's appeal, and I'm very pleased with how they turned out. Now there is one very obvious thing I'm still missing, and that's the player design. I haven't gotten around to making it yet, because it's a bit more complicated than everything else, but chances are that's the next thing I'm going to be working on, so stay tuned for that. Thanks for watching. Bye.